Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 32 from book 4 of De Bello Gallico. So remember, at this point of the Gallic Wars, book 4 is really focused in on the invasion of Britain, or the expedition to Britain. Now in the previous chapters we've seen that there's been some blunders along the way, right, including not all the ships getting there, the storm, the cavalry not being there, Caesar being stuck, not having enough food in the winter coming, all these different things. But now we've seen that Caesar's kind of gotten the situation a little under control, right? They have a fort, or at least a camp. They're out trying to get supplies. They're refitting and repairing the boats. But what's happening in the background is the British tribes have gone back on the peace treaty and they're getting ready to attack the Romans and hopefully starve them out. Right now, in the previous chapter, we saw Caesar say that he knew this, but in this chapter, we're going to see that they weren't necessarily expecting the British to attack, and we'll kind of unpack all that as we go. Now, before we dive in, like I always tell you on these, the thing you want to do first is kind of pre-read and make a vocab list, or find a commentary and get a vocab list. It's just so much easier to read the Latin when you know what the words mean. So start with vocab, memorize it. That'll just make your life a lot easier as you go. The other thing you want to do is try to read this aloud, right? So if you can read it to a classmate, work on your speaking, your pronunciation, have them read it back to you so you can work on your listening. These are always great tools. You never want to shut off and just translate in your head. That's not the best way to learn the language. So I'd suggest that you don't do that. And it's kind of easy if you're, in class with a partner, a classmate, whatever, you can work on that. The other thing I do to really master this is try the read and reread method. I say it all the time in my videos, but it's a really good technique to really, sort of master the Latin, particularly in something if you're doing this for an AP class where there's so much Latin coming at you, it can be hard to remember all of it. Doing this method will help you kind of retain it a little bit better. So what you want to do is read through, do a first read, and write down any problem areas you have, whether it's vocab words, sentences, grammar, anything. Don't stop to look it up. Just write it down, read all the way through the chapter, and then go back and try to figure out where you went wrong. The vocab is easy. You can just look the words up. The grammar can be trickier. This is where having a good commentary will kind of help you out, or just kind of looking up the words. There's a bunch of tools out there that can kind of help you out with the grammar of it. Then you go back and you read it again. And on the second time, you just keep repeating this 2, 3, 4, as many times as you need to. And what you're looking for is a point where you can read through this without needing any vocab help, without needing to look up a commentary or grammar, and that you're able to understand the vast majority, if not all, of the Latin. That's how you know you're in a really good place. And when you move on, you can feel comfortable that you're probably going to remember it for things like the AP test, if that's what you're working on. Okay? So if you haven't done that, I'd suggest you pause the video, go do that, and come back. But I'm going to move forward and assume that you've already done that and you feel like you're in a good place. And you can just use the rest of the video as sort of a double check to make sure you're on the right track. Okay? So it starts like this. You have dum ea geruntur, legione ex consuetudine, una frumentatum missa, quae appellebator, and then you have the number 7, right, VII, neque ulla ad id tempus belli suspicione interposita, cum pars hominum in agris remaneret, pars etiam in castra ventitare, da 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 da. Okay, so this is sort of the first chunk of a really kind of big opening line. Okay. So we start with this. You have, while these things are done or are being done, right? Meaning they're getting all the camp ready, and the Britons, are kind of plotting against the Romans. So it's sort of like a back at the ranch opening, right? So while these things are being done, then you have an ablative absolute here. You have with the legion, right? Consuetudine una. Here you're going to say with the legion customarily, or as custom. Or even the ex consuetudine, you could say like according to custom is kind of another way to do it. So they having been sent out, the missa, right? Having been sent out to frumentatum. Now here you have the supine with frumentatum, right? So it's really expressing purpose. So when you see frumentatum, it means to get grain is kind of what's going on. And the una there is going with one. So one legion, right? Having been with, or you might even say with one legion having been sent out to get grain, as was, customary ex consuetudine. Okay, so there's one legion out gathering food is kind of the idea. And then you have quae appellebator, 7, right? So which was called the 7th. So the 7th legion is the one that's been sent out. Okay, then it continues and you have neque ulla, and not with any at that time, right? Any suspicione interposita. So not with any suspicion, you could say, having been introduced, right? Interposita. Meaning they're not suspicious at all. And it's any suspicion at that time of war, right? A suspicion of war. So in other words, Caesar is saying that when they send out the 7th Legion, they're not expecting the British to attack, right? Even though earlier he does say, he was anticipating this, they're still not expecting anything to happen. Okay, so one legion has been sent out to gather grain, right, frumentatum, and then you have, as a side note, right, there's no suspicion at all, right, neque ulla suspicione, no suspicion introduced, rather, at that time that there'd be any war, right, suspicion of war. Okay, then you have cum pars hominum in agris remanere. You have another phrase here. So you have, well, part of the men, meaning part of the soldiers, remanere, remained in the fields in agris, right, and also part, right, pars in castra, in camp, right? Here you have ventitare, which is the frequentive. So one way to translate this is they kept coming, or frequentative rather. They kept coming into camp is kind of one way. One way to do that. It comes from venio, right? So you could say with part of the men sort of remaining in the fields, and another part, kept coming into camp. So it means that they're sort of funneling back into camp, not all at once, is really the idea. So when you're envisioning this, you want to think of a bunch of soldiers. They're out there, they're gathering rather. Some are still gathering up food, others are coming back, and they're trying to forage whatever they can in order to sort of get the supplies that they need. Then you go on to the next part of the line, right? And we'll finish this for opening sentence. You have eiqui proportis castrorum in statione erant Caesari nuntia verunt, pulverem maiorem quam consuetudo feret in ea parte videri quam in partem legio iter fecisset. Okay? So while all this is happening, right, there's men out, all these things are happening. Eiqui means those who, right? So those who were errant in stationi. It literally means something like in station, but I've seen commentaries say on duty. I think that's probably the best translation for it. So those who were on duty, pro portis castrorum, in front of the gates of the camp, right? So they're in a Roman army camp. They'd have sort of a wooden wall, gates, all these things. The men that they have in front, stationed in front of the gate, they nuntia verunt, they announced to Caesar, Caesari, right? There's your dative. So they announced to Caesar that. You have this indirect statement, right? Because we don't have a quote of what they said. Okay? So they announced that more dust, pulverem maiorem. So, and then you have the maiorem quam. So more than is really where they're going. So more dust than was usual. Consuetudo, there's that word again. Than was custom, right? It's going with ferret, which kind of means to carry or bear. You could translate it as more than custom, kind of bore out. I think is one way I've seen it translated. It's basically saying more than custom would normally have. So a sort of simpler way to put this into English is to say that they announced that more dust than was usual, right? Was seen, videre, right? You have the indirect statement, so your infinitive there, you translate as was seen, in ea parte, in that part, right? And it's that part into which, quam in partem, right? Into which part the legio, the legion, interfecisset, had made a journey. There you have the pluperfect subjunctive there. So if you step back to where they're announcing, right, you're talking about the guards, the gate guards, basically, eiqui. So those who were stationed at the gates, they told Caesar that more dust than was usual, than custom would bear, was seen in that part, right, into which the legion had made a journey. So what they're looking at, if you kind of step back and think of, put yourself in Caesar's perspective, they're looking out into probably woods or open area, probably more like woods, and they're seeing a giant cloud of dust, and they're recognizing that based on how many Roman soldiers we sent out, this is too much dust, if that makes sense. So the dust cloud is telling them that something else is happening, and this isn't just our legion coming back. So then he starts the next section with himself, right? So you have Caesar id quod erat suspicatus, okay? So you're saying Caesar suspecting or having suspected id quod erat, that which was, right? And some commentators will tell you to translate this as that which was, like the case. So in other words, what this is saying is Caesar's giving himself credit, saying he had suspected something like this was going to happen, and what he suspected actually was, right? That's where you get this kind of odd phrase of Caesar having suspected that which was, right? Meaning which was to be, okay? So in other words, Caesar's saying he already had a feeling this was going to happen. So now he continues and tells you what it is that he suspected. So again, you can almost translate it as, having suspected that which was, namely that, right? He's about to tell you what he suspected. Aliquid novi literally means something like something of the new. We usually translate as something new, right? Something new by the barbarians, barbaris. He's talking about the Britons, right? So initum here is really initum, and it's missing its form of esse, right? So it's really just the perfect passive. So that something new or some new concilii, some new plan is probably the best way to do it, had been initiated, right? Initum with a version of esse had been started or had been initiated by the barbarians, right? That's what he's suspecting. That they're coming with some new plan, namely that they're going to attack the Romans. So now he's going to transition into what he does of this, right? So he gives you the side note with the participle, right? Suspecting this that the barbarians are going to do something, right? They've come up with some new plan. To figure out what he does, you have to go all the way to the end to use it. He ordered. Okay. So what did he do? Well, the first thing he does is he ordered the cohortes, right? So you have cohortes qua in statione errant, right? So the cohorts which were in statione, on duty, right? Meaning the ones that are armed and ready to go. So he ordered those cohorts, right? Proficisci to depart secum with him into that region or that part, in eam partem, meaning the part with all the dust. So the first thing he does is he orders the cohorts who are ready to fight to come with him. Right, that's his first order. Then you have ex reliquis duas in stationem succedere. So from the rest, right, the others, you might say, the other two duas in stationem, on duty, succedere. So he ordered that one follow him and two from the rest to succeed him to succeed them on duty, meaning to basically go on duty themselves. So he has the ones who are already ready, and from the rest, he gets two more ready to go, basically, is the idea of succedere. So again, he's got the ones who are ready. He takes from all the rest of them, right, ex reliquis, he orders two to get on duty, right, sort of replace them on duty, succeed them on duty in stationem. Then he has reliquas, the rest. So he ordered the rest, armari, to be armed. Right, because you have to imagine they're hanging around the camp. They're not all walking around, in their battle armor, ready to go. So he orders the rest of his soldiers to be armed and immediately confestem, right? Immediately to follow. Se means themselves, so immediately themselves to subsequi, to follow, right? To follow him. So he's ordering all his troops to get ready to go, to get ready for battle, because he's going to lead out an attack. Not assuming, he knows that the British tribes are coming, and he just needs to get his men reorganized. So here we really see Caesar's skill as a leader as he takes the situation kind of by the reins, and he gets everything organized. Everyone has their orders, and now the Roman army is ready to sort of respond to this new threat. Then you have cum Paolo Longus a castris processisse, suos ab hostibus premi atque aegre sustinere, et conferta legione ex omnibus partibus tela coici animad verte. Okay, so when, right, cum, so when a little further, right, Paolo Longus, a little further from camp, a castris, processisse, he had proceeded, right, you have a cum clause going with the subjunctive here. So when he had gone a little bit further away from camp, right, he's marched out. Okay, and then you have his men. So again, you want to go all the way to the bottom, probably to animad verte. He noticed that it's an indirect statement. He noticed that his men were pressed, premi, right? They were pressed ab hostibus, by the enemy, meaning they're being attacked by the enemy and they're kind of getting pushed in, and it's not going well. So that they were pressed by the enemy and scarcely aegre, right? Scarcely sustinere, sustaining, right? Holding on. And conferta legione, right? You have the ablative absolute here with the legion, conferta, packed together, right? From all parts, ex omnibus partibus, tela, weapons were thrown, right? Were thrown at them from all different directions is the idea. Right, so this line gives you a good sense of what's going on, right? And it doesn't sound good. Again, so when Caesar gets out there, he's realizing, right, animad verte, you have your head verb, he's realizing that his men are in a tough spot. They're being pressed by the enemy. They're, remember, aegre sustinere, they're barely sustaining it, meaning kind of barely holding on, and they're so packed together that the enemy is just chucking weapons at them. So you have to imagine that the Romans are in a very tight formation. They're probably surrounded, and they're just having, javelins, arrows, whatever it might be, spears being thrown at them. This is the situation that Caesar kind of encounters when he goes out to help his men. Then we go on to the next line. You have nam quod omni ex reliquis partibus demesso frumento pars una erat reliqua suspicati hostes huc nostros esse venturos noctu in silvis delituerant ... Okay, so Caesar's telling you why this happened. Again, he's speaking from hindsight, so he's writing after this has already happened. So how did this happen? How did the legions get attacked like this? And he says, for because, okay, and then you have an ablative absolute here. So with all from the remaining parts, right, from the remaining parts, with all the grain having been, the frumento having been, demesso having been reaped, right? So with all the grain having been taken from the remaining parts, okay, pars una, so one part was remaining, erat reliqua. So in other words, they've gone out and they've already, taken up all the grain, the food, the frumento that they could get, right? So there was only one part that was left where food was, okay? So if the British know this, then obviously they're going to wait there for the Romans. They know where they're going to show up. So Caesar's identifying that we'd already been to all these other places. There was only one place left, okay? Then you have the hostes, the enemy, having suspected that, right, suspicati. So having suspected that our men, nostros, who means here, so that our men, venturos esse, they would come here to this one place that's left. What do the British do, the hostes? Well, at night, noctu, they had hidden, delituerant, they had hidden themselves really in silvis, in the woods. So the idea is the British are watching the situation. Remember, they were trying to starve the Romans out or kind of catch them in an attack, not open battle. They're watching where they're foraging, and they realize that there's really only one place left with food. So instead of like destroying or anything, that's where they set their trap. They wait in the woods around this one place. They go there at night, and they know that the Romans have to show up. That's the trap that the British tribes spring on the Romans, and then when they show up, they obviously attack them. Then it continues, and you have tum dispersos, depositis armis in mettendo, occupatos subito adorti, paucis interfectis, reliquos incertis ordinibus, perturbarerant, simul equitatu atque essedis circum dederant. Okay, so a long sentence here with kind of a lot going on, different ablative absolutes, all these things. Okay, so they hide in the night, right, is the idea. So it's picking up. So then, having put down their weapons, depositis armis, right, talking about the men, right, he's talking about his men, nostros. So dispersos here, having dispersed, he's talking about the Roman soldiers. So having dispersed, and with their arms, their weapons having been put down, right, so they're obviously not carrying any weapons when you're out, kind of foraging for food, okay? In mettendo, right, means in the reaping is really what's happening here. You have a gerund, right? So having put down their arms in the reaping, meaning the reaping of the food, and they're really occupatos in mettendo. So they're occupied in the reaping, meaning they're kind of occupied or having been occupied with getting all this food. The foraging is really what it means. Suddenly, right? So subito, this is when they attack. So adorti, having attacked, paucis interfectis, with few having been killed, right? With a few of the Romans having been killed, and adorti there is really talking about the British, the enemy. So the enemy attacked, and having killed a few, the rest, reliquos, meaning the rest of the Romans, they perturbaverant, they threw into confusion, meaning the enemy having attacked them threw the rest of the Roman troops, reliquos, into confusion, incertis ordinibus, with uncertain or sort of confused ranks. Ordinibus is talking about the ranks of the Roman army. Maybe I think in some commentaries they'll say in unfixed ranks or unorganized ranks. It means they're kind of scattered all over the place, right? Because they're not ready for a battle. And at the same time, circum dederant, they had surrounded them, right, with equitatu, with cavalry, and assedis. Now, assedis means war chariots, and I think a lot of commentaries point out that this word is a Gallic word, not a Latin one. But either way, it's describing the war chariots that the British tribes like to use in battle. Okay, so they've got chariots running around them. They've got cavalry. The Romans are surrounded. This is why it's such a tough spot for the Roman army. And again, you want to notice the description that Caesar's using here. It's really fascinating to hear him talk about casualties for the Roman army. So he's saying that only a few got killed. Is that true? It's hard to tell. But you got to imagine if you have a bunch of soldiers isolated in the woods, they're foraging, they're not holding weapons, right? Their arms they've put down. did only a few of them get killed? It kind of seems like he's glossing over how many probably died. If you get attacked and you're surrounded by cavalry, like it's a really tough spot and it's not going well is kind of the idea. But either way, Caesar, this is where when he gets into sort of the battle, Caesar gives pretty good descriptions. And it really shows you his style as he's trying to describe to you pretty clearly what's going on. And you want to think about why he's doing this. But again, he's showing you the British style of attack. It really is an ambush is what the Romans have walked into here. And he does a great job of describing it. Now, when he mentions the war chariots, this is obviously not a picture from this specific battle. This is a picture of the warrior Queen Boudica, right? The Iceni queen who leads a rebellion against the Romans, years and years later. But in this statue of her, she's driving a war chariot. And obviously, this is more of a modern reconstruction, but this is kind of what you're getting at. And you want to envision with the British chariots attacking the Romans. You might have a couple horses pulling a chariot. Maybe you have one or two drivers, right? One or two people on the chariot. One will be a driver, and then you have someone in the back who can chuck weapons. This is what the Romans are facing, which probably would have been a little scary. If you're a Roman legionary, you're surrounded. You don't have, you're attacked without your weapons. You're in confusion. It's really not a great spot for the Romans. But again, to give you a sense of what the war chariots are, this is really what you want to envision. Okay? So there's a lot of things to kind of unpack here and think about. But in the previous chapter, right, Caesar mentioned that he suspects treachery from the British tribes. So he mentions that he had already thought about this. And he references it again in this chapter, right? He has a feeling that something's going on. So the question you want to think about is that true and do we believe him? Because if he knew something was going on, why would you let this happen, right? Why would you send out foraging parties without armed soldiers or at least warn them that you're probably going to be attacked? It's kind of interesting. Did he know? Maybe, but he doesn't seem to do much about it, which is kind of interesting to think about. Is he kind of thinking in hindsight to make himself sound a little bit better? Like, oh yeah, of course I knew we were going to be attacked. Yeah, it's a little bit tough to unpack. You also want to think about the logistics, right, of how that comes back into play. Whose fault is this? Why are the men even out foraging? Well, it's because this whole expedition is really badly planned. Their ships got sunk, they don't have enough food, and now they have to go out and forage, and they're kind of stuck. So again, the background to these chapters is Caesar made a tough logistical decision and really made a mistake, and now he's paying for it as the British tribes keep attacking him. Okay, the one thing on his that's good for Caesar, you might say, kind of a checkbox in the good column, is notice how he leads the sortie, right? So this is a trademark of Caesar as a general. He's known to lead from the front. He does this in a bunch of different battles. He inspires his men, and he does it here too, right? He doesn't send out another general to handle it. He's the one who leads the Roman army from the camp, right? He gathers all the men he can. He gives the orders, and he goes out to sort of save the day. And notice how he tells you that, right? You have to remember this is really a propaganda piece for himself. So he wants to write how he was in the front line. It makes him seem like more heroic, which he was. Obviously, if he was out in the front line, he probably was. But it definitely adds to his sort of legend of being this heroic general. Okay. The other thing you want to notice is how the British are attacking the Romans. If the British are doing this ambush style, you want to think about the strength of both armies and where they stand. If the British know the Romans are stuck, they only have a few legions here. It's not like they have a full Roman army. They're still not openly attacking them. That's kind of interesting, and it goes back to that battle on the beach where the Romans do overcome the British. In terms of strength, I don't know if that's really the right term or not, but the British still have a fear of the Romans, right? They're not just assuming they'll be able to crush them because they don't really attack them like that. They do resort to an ambush, right? It kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what the British are thinking of and sort of the strength of both armies. Okay. The other thing you want to think about is the Romans are attacked without weapons and they're caught off guard. Okay. I mentioned this before. Caesar says with only a few having been killed, if you're caught off guard and you're not holding weapons, do we believe this, right? And whenever Caesar gives accounts of numbers of men killed on the Roman side, you want to assume that he's not giving you the truth, right? So it's usually, we killed thousands and thousands of British and we lost 5 men. It's like, okay, do we really believe that? This is an example of that where you're not entirely sure that he's being truthful, and he's probably not, right? He doesn't want to admit that a lot of men died, but we can interpret that in this ambush, more than he's letting on probably did die. Okay. And the last thing you want to think about is the description of his men being incertis ordinibus, right? So he says that the problem is they're in unfixed lines. This is just interesting to me because I want you to think as you read about the Roman army and its strength. It's actually a very similar problem to the beach landing. The Roman strength is in discipline and formations, right? They don't fight as individuals. That's really not their style. It's all about being in a formation and having tactics. in the beach landing in the beginning of chapter 4. That's why they're getting killed, right? They can't organize themselves. And it happens again here. So whenever you see mention of a Roman army being basically out of order or not able to organize themselves, that's where things go really, really wrong. Okay. Once they can get into their ranks and ordered, then that discipline usually overcomes any obstacle they might run into. And you're going to see as we go on, Caesar is going to show up and try to bring some of that discipline back, which is why if you can ambush a Roman army, it's probably the best tactic to do, because they're not able to use their main strength to their advantage. Okay, so just some things to think about as you dive into this chapter from book 4. So if you have any questions at all in the translation, I know this section in particular is filled with a couple more trickier lines. They're basically long, very long sentences filled with a bunch of different pieces. So if you have questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm happy to help. But otherwise, just keep at it. Take it a little bit at a time, right? Use all the resources you have and just think through. You'll catch Caesar's style. He starts to repeat it a lot as he goes. But hopefully it wasn't too bad. If it was, like I said, watch the video, try it again, and really try to unpack it. You're aiming again for a point where you can read through this without needing any help and you understand the vast majority, if not all of it. That's how you know you're ready to move on. Good luck.